According to Christians, Jesus Christ is God, and here Jesus Christ is forgiving his enemies without believing in him, without believing in the so-called crucifixion and so-called resurrection. So sins can be forgiven without believing in Jesus Christ, without believing in crucifixion, and without believing in resurrection. So this verse is a huge problem for Christian theology. It destroys everything. Because enemies were forgiven without believing in Jesus, without believing in crucifixion, without believing in resurrection. So why can't we be forgiven? So according to this verse, there is no need to believe in Jesus Christ. There is no need to believe in crucifixion. There is no need to believe in resurrection of Jesus Christ. Because without believing all of these nonsense, we can be forgiven. Because Jesus Christ forgave his enemies who were actually non-believers. So why can't we be forgiven? So there is no need to believing in Jesus Christ as God incarnate. I challenge every David Wood and other these arrogant assholes, show me a single verse in the entire Old Testament from the any version of the Old Testament which says that Christ died for our sins and he was buried and raised after 3 days. Show me a single verse from any version of the Old Testament. I will accept Christianity. It's my challenge to these arrogant assholes and other so-called Christian assholes. Because Paul says Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures and he was buried and raised after 3 days in accordance with the scriptures. So show me a single verse from the entire Old Testament from any version of the Bible which says that Christ died for the sins of mankind and he was buried and raised after 3 days. I will accept Christianity. Show me in those exact words a single verse from the any version of the Old Testament. Because Paul is saying it's all about according to the scriptures. So show me from the scriptures. And scriptures means Old Testament. Because when Paul was writing this shit, the New Testament was not even in existence. Even the 4 so-called Gospels were written after the decades later Jesus Christ, and even after the decades later Paul. So show me a single verse about the prediction of crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ. I will accept Christianity. It's my challenge. But you can't show a single verse because it didn't exist. Even the conservative biblical scholar states that these verses didn't exist. Brothers and sisters in faith, so today I am going to debunk these arrogant assholes who can't even read a single verse from their so-called scriptures, and they are going to teach us about Islam. So let's begin.
Sahih Bukhari 69:29, the hadith to end the Quran. Yeah, I love this one. This one is, as if I'm looking at the Prophet while he was speaking about one of the prophets whose people have beaten and wounded him, and he was wiping the blood off his face, saying, "Oh Lord, forgive my people as they do not know." Who could that be from all the prior prophets? I don't know, guys. I'm stunned. Who do you think that could be? All the prior prophets. Surely it can't be Jesus, could it?
To deceive people, to convert them into so-called Christianity, they quote a narration from Sahih Bukhari that a prophet who was beaten by his own people, wiping the blood from his face and saying, "Oh Allah, forgive my people, for they do not know what they are doing." And these arrogant assholes are trying their best to fit this narration on Jesus Christ.
This hadith, you see it on the screen?
Yeah, I see it.
It says, narrated Abdullah, as if I am looking at the Prophet while he was speaking about one of the prophets, whose people have beaten and wounded him, and he was wiping the blood off his face, saying, "Oh Lord, forgive my people, as they do not know." Who do you think that is?
Of course, it's Jesus Christ.
Do you know when Jesus said this?
Do I know when Jesus said this?
Yeah.
Yeah, when he was on the cross.
Exactly. So Jesus said this when he was on the cross, and you have an authentic hadith pointing to Jesus when he was on the cross. So it's affirming the crucifixion.
ये हदीस में लिखा है साहिह बुखारी में, अब्दुल्ला ने लिखा, as if I'm looking at the prophet, मैं कैसे नबी को देख रहा हूं, जैसे मैं बात कर रहा हूं उस नबी के बारे में, whose people have beaten, उनके लोगों ने उनको पीटा, उनको घायल किया और उसको मारा, और उसने खून को जो है अपने चेहरे से पूछा, और उस नबी ने कहा, हे खुदा, इन लोगों को तू माफ कर। कहीं सुना लग रहा है? सुना लग रहा है? उस नबी के बारे में मैं बात कर रहा हूं जिसको उन्हीं के लोगों ने पीटा, उसको मारा, घायल किया और लहू से उसने अपने मुंह को जो है पूछा और कहा, हे खुदा, इनको माफ करो। ये कहां पढ़ते हैं? ये चीज को हम पढ़ते हैं लूका की किताब 23वां अध्याय में 34वें वचन में। कुछ लोग कहेंगे, अरे नहीं ऐसे बहुत सारे नबी होंगे, लेकिन इसको जो है हम जबरदस्ती कहते हैं। जबरदस्ती।
Point number 1, there is no mention of crucifixion and there is no mention of who this prophet actually was. In Sahih Bukhari, there are special chapters dedicated to Prophet Jesus and Mother Mary, and the hadith related to him. However, this hadith is not placed under those chapters. That clearly means this prophet is somebody else, not Jesus Christ. Now the question arises, if it's not Jesus, then who is this prophet actually was? The answer is, the prophet in this narration is actually Prophet Nooh alayhi salam. As Imam Ibn Asakir rahimahullah clearly stated in his Tarikh Dimshaq, volume number 62, page number 247. Imam Ibn Asakir quoted this hadith in the chapter of Prophet Nooh alayhi salam and transmitted the narrations that this prophet is Prophet Nooh alayhi salam when he was beaten by his people and he was saying, "Oh Allah, forgive my people, for they do not know what they are doing." Even Imam Hafiz ibn Hajar Asqalani rahimahullah stated in Fathul Bari in the commentary of this hadith that this hadith is about beloved Prophet Nooh alayhi salam. These are the clear evidences from Islamic sources that this hadith is actually about beloved Prophet Nooh alayhi salam, who was beaten by his people, by his nation, and he was saying, "Oh Allah, forgive my people, for they do not know what they are doing." So it's clear that this hadith has nothing to do with Jesus Christ, as these arrogant assholes want us to believe. Now again, the question arises, is Jesus, as the Christians claim, is the only prophet whose people tried to kill him? Or were there other prophets also who were beaten and killed by their people? Like Jesus Christ said in Gospel of Matthew that Zechariah, son of Berechiah, was killed by his people near the temple. Also in the Old Testament, Zechariah, the son of Jehodiah, was also killed by his people. Now Christians may object that even if some prophets were beaten and killed by their people, why do we see them saying, "Oh Father," or "Oh God, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing"? This is a genuine question. So our reply is the same. It's not proven that Jesus Christ ever said these words either. The verse in Luke chapter 23, verse number 24 is doubtful and is missing from the earliest manuscripts and highly criticized by the New Testament scholars. Because this verse is absent from the earliest manuscripts, that's why scholars criticized this verse. Dr. Bardi Ahherman, in his book The Textual Criticism of the New Testament, on page number 3 and 4, Dr. Bardi Ahherman criticized this verse. Dr. Bruce Metzger also criticized the verse. Raymond E. Brown also criticized this verse in his book The Death of the Messiah, volume 2. The verse is missing from Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus. These are the earliest and the best manuscripts, but this fabricated verse is missing from them. So actually this verse is fabricated by the scribes or the Christian fathers to show the world that Jesus Christ forgave his enemies. The NIV Bible, the ESV Bible, the NRSV Bible, and many other Bibles clearly states in footnotes that this verse is not in many earliest manuscripts. But this makes a huge theological problem for Christians. You know why? Because according to Christians, Jesus Christ is God, and here Jesus Christ is forgiving his enemies without believing in him, without believing in the so-called crucifixion and so-called resurrection. So sins can be forgiven without believing in Jesus Christ, without believing in crucifixion, and without believing in resurrection. So this verse is a huge problem for Christian theology. It destroys everything. Because enemies were forgiven without believing in Jesus, without believing in crucifixion, without believing in resurrection. So why can't we be forgiven? So according to this verse, there is no need to believe in Jesus Christ, there is no need to believe in crucifixion, there is no need to believe in resurrection of Jesus Christ, because without believing all of these nonsense, we can be forgiven, because Jesus Christ forgave his enemies who were actually non-believers. So why can't we be forgiven? So there is no need to believing in Jesus Christ as God incarnate, no need to believing crucifixion, no need to believing in resurrection. So this verse destroys everything. Christian theology teaches that Christ's death was preordinated by God. So if it was God's plan, then the Jewish leaders and the Roman soldiers were fulfilling the God's will, not acting out of independent evil. In that case, why would they need forgiveness how can they be blamed for carrying out what was predestined? This is a huge theological contradiction, because if the crucifixion was God's will, that means enemies were the innocent people. So there is no need to blame them. They were fulfilling the God's promise. And if enemies are truly guilty, that means crucifixion was not God's will. So the Christian theology collapses under its own weight, meaning atonement collapses. Crucifixion and resurrection is the biggest lie spread by Paul and his followers.